In this chapter, we're going to talk about how to create basic animations in Flash. Before we start creating animations, it's important to understand how the timeline works. And that's what we'll talk about in this movie. The file I'm working in is called o1_exploring_timeline.fla, and it's in the Chapter 4 folder in the Exercise Files folder. You can follow along if you'd like, but for this exercise, you won't necessarily need to. There are a few key terms that you need to be familiar with in regards to the timeline. The first is the playhead. The playhead is the red rectangle at the top of the timeline. If you click and drag the playhead, you can preview an animation. The playhead also tells you what frame you're currently working in. Another important part of the timeline are the frame numbers. Frame numbers correspond to a point in time. The frame numbers are labeled at the top of the timeline. Every 5 frames, you'll see the frame number. So we have frame 1, frame 5, frame 10, frame 15, etc. This is to help you navigate through the timeline. So throughout this chapter, I'm going to be saying, select frame 4, go to frame 10, etc. You can use these markers to identify where you are. Sometimes it's hard to tell the frame numbers in between the marked frames. Here's a tip to quickly recognize what frame you're working on. If I move the playhead in between frame 5 and frame 10, I can tell what frame I'm working on. Flash is a simple way for you to tell which frame you're working on. At the bottom of the timeline, there are 3 numbers. The number on the left represents the current frame you're working on. So I can tell now that I'm working in frame 8. And that's how you can know which frame you're currently working in. The second number tells you how many frames per second your movie is playing. This says 3.0 FPS. FPS stands for frames per second. The way that an animation works is the frames are played in a sequence, and that sequence creates an animation. The faster the frames per second are played, the faster the animation will be. Frames per second is also known as the frame rate of a Flash movie. We'll talk a little bit more about frame rates later on. The third number at the bottom of the timeline represents how many seconds into the movie we are. The playhead is at frame 8. The movie is being played at 3 frames per second. And so in real time, that would be 2.3 seconds into the movie. And that's a little bit about how the timeline is organized.